The shot echoed through the quiet streets of Geneva, a city known for its strict morals and religious fervor. It was May 1773, and the air was thick with the scent of spring. But for the Tronchin family, the day was anything but peaceful. Jean-Louis Tronchin, a respected man in the city, had just taken his own life in the basement of his home. The news spread quickly. Servants, neighbors, and family members rushed to the scene. Dr. Bottini, who had been caring for Tronchin during his brief illness, was among the first to arrive. He had visited Tronchin twice a day for the past week, treating him for insomnia and a light fever. On the day of his death, Bottini found Tronchin extremely nervous and melancholic. He prescribed carriage rides, tepid baths, and a better diet. But nothing seemed to help. Tronchin's valet, Frederick Greme, reported that his master had been acting strange, saying his head was spinning. A family friend, Gideon Turrettini, a former syndic, came to visit, hoping to lift Tronchin's spirits. But Tronchin was barely talkative, complaining about a fever and a 10-day sleepless night. He insisted that his soul was suffering, not his body. Despite the efforts to cheer him up, Tronchin's condition worsened. He moaned about a pain in his abdomen and repeatedly said, "It's the soul, it's the soul." His wife convinced him to take a bath as Dr. Bottini had recommended. After the bath, Tronchin was left alone to dress. Moments later, a shot rang out from the basement. The family and servants frantically searched for Tronchin, and the sound of the shot led them to the basement. There they found him the victim of his own hand, a rifle wound in his throat. Neighbors rushed to get a surgeon, but it was too late. Jean-Louis Tronchin was dead. The investigation that followed was thorough. Witnesses, from servants to Turrettini, stressed the medical causes of Tronchin's suicide. Dr. Bottini's testimony was central. He described Tronchin's physical ailments, insomnia, and the vaporous state that had consumed him. No one mentioned prayer or God. Tronchin's death was seen as the result of an illness, not a sin or a demonic act. This case was not unique. By the late 1700s, Geneva, like other parts of Europe, had begun to view suicide through a medical lens. In the early modern period, suicide was often attributed to supernatural causes, demonic possession, or divine judgment. But by the end of the 18th century, these explanations were giving way to natural medical ones. In England, the shift was influenced by the political and religious turmoil of the 17th century. The ruling classes, repelled by religious fanaticism, sought natural explanations for phenomena like suicide. Scientific advancements also played a role, leading to the belief that mental illnesses could be treated with medicine. Physicians, though not highly respected at the time, contributed to this change. In Geneva, the process was similar. As seen in Tronchin's case, the focus was on physical and mental ailments, not spiritual ones. The terms used to describe mental illnesses were vague and often confusing. Melancholy could mean anything from depression to physical illness. Frenzy or furor might involve delirium or violent behavior. By the 18th century, French medical writers categorized mental illnesses into three main types: phrenesy, feverishness; manie, tension and dryness of fibers in the brain; and melancholy, imbalances in brain liquids. Despite the lack of precision, these terms helped to shift the conversation from sin to sickness. The medicalization of suicide had a significant impact on how deaths were reported. If suicide was seen as a result of mental illness, it could be excused. This might seem like a reason to be more open about suicide, but it often had the opposite effect. Families feared the stigma of mental illness. especially since it was believed to be hereditary. Covering up a suicide, even in a city as strict as Geneva, was not uncommon. The records from Geneva's criminal investigations reveal a lot about the biases of the time. Women and the poor were more likely to be described as alienated or mad, while men and the wealthy were often labeled melancholic. This reflects the view that women were less stable and more prone to insanity. The wealthy, on the other hand, were often seen as more susceptible to depression, a condition that was less stigmatized. Physical illness was also a common motive for suicide. The poor, who had less access to medical care and faced harsher living conditions, were more likely to fall ill. However, the wealthy were overrepresented among those who committed suicide due to physical or mental illnesses. This suggests that the poor had other more pressing reasons to take their lives, such as poverty or social pressures. The shift in how suicide was viewed in Geneva was gradual but significant. By the late 1700s, the city had moved away from seeing suicide as a sin or a demonic act and toward viewing it as a medical issue. The case of Jean-Louis Tronchin is a clear example of this change. His death was attributed to his physical and mental state, not his moral failings. As the 18th century progressed, the medicalization of suicide became more pronounced. The number of suicides attributed to mental and physical illnesses increased, but the percentage of suicides affected by these factors actually decreased. This suggests that the medicalization of suicide was not just a change in terminology, but a real shift in how society understood and dealt with the issue. In the quiet aftermath of the shot in the basement, the Tronchin family and the city of Geneva were forced to confront a new reality. Suicide was no longer a matter of sin or divine judgment. It was a matter of health, and the medical community was at the forefront of understanding and addressing it. The world was changing, and with it, the way people thought about life and death. In the late 18th century, Geneva, a small city in Switzerland, saw a sharp rise in suicides. Some people wondered if this increase was linked to changes in the population, such as people living longer and having better health. Let's explore this idea and see if there's more to the story. During the early modern period, Geneva faced many challenges, including deadly diseases like the plague and smallpox. These diseases often took the lives of young children and adults, making life expectancy quite short. However, by the late 18th century, the situation had improved. The last major outbreak of the plague in Geneva was in 1636–40, and smallpox, which was once a major killer of young children, became less deadly. As a result, people in Geneva started living longer. Life expectancy at birth increased from 23.6 years in the mid-17th century to about 33 to 34 years by the late 18th century. For 10-year-olds, life expectancy increased from 39.5 years to 46.3 years. The number of people over 55 also grew steadily. With people living longer, it might seem logical that more older individuals would face the challenges of aging, such as physical and mental illnesses and social isolation. These factors can make life more difficult and could potentially lead to more suicides. Indeed, there are examples of older Genevans who took their own lives because of these issues. For instance, Marc Pictet, a former syndic and a friend of Voltaire, ended his life at 75 after suffering from severe abdominal pains. Another example is Pierre Granis, an attorney who suffered from migraines, abdominal pains, and urine retention, and drowned himself at 78. Robert Dunant, a church elder and former syndic, committed suicide at 71 after battling depression. However, when we look at the average age of all suicides in Geneva, we find that the increase in longevity may not have been the main reason for the rise in suicides. The average age of suicides in the first half of the 18th century was 42.5 years, and it only slightly increased to 42.8 years in the second half. This small change suggests that the increase in longevity did not significantly affect the age at which people were taking their own lives. Moreover, those who committed suicide due to physical or mental illnesses were not much older than other suicides. For example, the average age of suicides motivated by physical illness was 44.3 years, and for those motivated by mental illness, it was 43.4 years. Even though these numbers increased slightly in the late 18th century, the increase was not large enough to explain the dramatic rise in suicides. So, if the increase in longevity wasn't the main cause, what else could have been driving the rise in suicides? One possible factor is the changing religious and cultural environment in Geneva. The 18th century was a time of significant change in Europe, particularly with the rise of the Enlightenment. This period saw a shift towards more secular and rational thinking. People began to question traditional religious beliefs and sought explanations for the world through science and reason rather than religion. Religion has long been seen as a protective factor against suicide. Strong religious beliefs can provide a sense of community purpose and comfort, which can help people cope with life's challenges. In Geneva, the influence of religion on daily life was changing. While people did not necessarily reject religion altogether, their beliefs were evolving. The belief in the devil and eternal damnation, which had once been strong deterrents against suicide, became less prominent. Intellectuals and even some members of the general public began to view the world in more scientific and rational terms. This shift in mentality, known as desacralization, might have made it easier for people to consider suicide as a viable option when facing difficulties. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, many European thinkers, including John Locke and Isaac Newton, emphasized the harmony between reason and religion. They argued that the natural world provided evidence of God's existence and benevolence. However, by the mid-1700s, deism had become popular among the educated classes. Deists believed that God could be understood through nature and reason, and that the best way to worship God was to live a moral life. This natural religion often rejected traditional Christian doctrines, such as the belief in the devil and eternal hell. The changing religious landscape in Geneva, combined with the broader cultural shift towards rationalism and secularism, might have contributed to the increase in suicides. People who no longer held strong religious beliefs might have felt less restrained from taking their own lives when facing hardship. The decline in the fear of eternal damnation and the weakening of religious community ties could have made suicide seem like a more acceptable solution to their problems. In the late 18th century, Geneva was a city in transition. While people were living longer and generally healthier lives, the changing religious and cultural environment might have played a significant role in the rise in suicides. The complex interplay between these factors highlights the multifaceted nature of social and cultural change during this period. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the idea of the devil was becoming less and less popular among the educated Europeans. The philosophers, who were thinkers of the Enlightenment, admired the rational ideas of John Locke and the scientific discoveries of Isaac Newton. They saw the devil as a silly superstition not worth their time to argue against. Voltaire, one of the most famous philosophers, once called the devil a disgusting fantasy, but even he didn't spend much time ridiculing the idea. The encyclopedia, a famous encyclopedia of the time, had only a short entry on the devil, joking that Ethiopians painted the devil white to contradict Europeans who painted him black, suggesting that both views were equally unfounded. The problem of evil was a different matter. Voltaire and other philosophers believed that nature provided rules for behavior, and through reason, humans could understand these rules. Voltaire almost treated nature like a god, but other thinkers went further. Denis Diderot, Claude Adrien, Helvetius, and Paul Thierry Baron d'Holbach were atheists who believed the universe was made of matter and had no supernatural creator. They thought the universe was formed by chance, and there was no room for God or the devil. The philosopher David Hume argued that the existence of evil in the world made it impossible to believe in a benevolent and omnipotent God. If nature is imperfect, then it can't be the work of a perfect God. Hume's arguments were powerful and attacked not only Christianity, but also deism, which believed in a distant, uninvolved God. Despite his strong stance against religion, Hume didn't bother attacking the idea of the devil directly. While many educated Europeans stopped believing in the devil by 1800, conservatives still defended traditional Christian beliefs. Pietism, a movement that emphasized faith over reason, was one such response. Pietists, who were strong in Lutheran Germany, insisted on the importance of the Bible and emotional experiences of faith. They feared that rational philosophy would lead to atheism and emphasized the need for an inner spiritual rebirth. Pietists and Methodists in England still believed in the devil and often talked about diabolical temptation. However, even among conservatives, there were differences. In France, Abbé Bergier, a critic of the philosophes, didn't mention the devil or hell when he condemned suicide as a sin. On the other hand, some liberal Christian thinkers tried to make their faith compatible with the rational scientific atmosphere of the Enlightenment. They viewed the Bible as a historical document and were uncomfortable with the idea that Jesus believed in the devil. By the end of the 18th century, some liberal theologians argued that Jesus was a product of his time and reflected the superstitions of his era. They also abandoned the idea of original sin and often avoided discussing the problem of evil. In Geneva, the influence of rationalism was significant. The Academy, which later became the University of Geneva, and the Company of Pastors, a group of ministers, were once strongholds of Calvinist orthodoxy. However, in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, these institutions began to change. Jean-Robert Chouet, a professor of philosophy, introduced Cartesian natural philosophy, which focused on science and reason. This shift attracted more students interested in science rather than theology. The Academy faced declining enrollment after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, which caused many French students to leave. To address this, the Council of 200, a group of merchants and professionals, pushed for more emphasis on science and mathematics in the curriculum. The Academy became more secular, with lay authorities playing a larger role in its governance. Jean-Alphonse Turretini, a theologian and the son of a prominent Calvinist, played a crucial role in these changes. He promoted the study of natural sciences and mathematics, arguing that reason and empirical methods should guide education. Turretini's vision was to find harmony between the new philosophy and Christian faith. He believed that the Copernican view of the universe, with its mechanistic laws, reflected divine providence. While he respected the Bible, he didn't insist on its inerrancy and favored a simpler set of core doctrines necessary for salvation. Turretini also blamed strict confessions of faith for causing divisions among Christians and worked to remove the Helvetic consensus formula, which required strict adherence to Calvinist doctrine. By the early 18th century, the intellectual atmosphere in Geneva had changed dramatically. The Company of Pastors became more tolerant, and the Academy became more secular. This shift had a broader impact on Geneva's society. Emile Durkheim, a sociologist, later argued that a religious society needs a shared set of beliefs to stay united. The more flexible the beliefs, the less cohesive the community. By loosening the requirements for religious beliefs, Turretini and others unintentionally weakened the religious fabric of Geneva, making the community more susceptible to issues like suicide. The late 1700s in Geneva were a time of great change. Rationalism, or the belief that reason and logic should guide human thought, was on the rise. This shift in thinking had a profound impact on the city, especially on its religious life. Geneva, once a stronghold of Calvinism, the strict Protestant faith founded by John Calvin, was now becoming a center of Enlightenment thought. The Enlightenment emphasized reason, science, and human progress, often at the expense of traditional religious beliefs. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, born in Geneva, and Voltaire, who lived nearby, were two of the most influential figures of the Enlightenment. Their ideas spread throughout the city, shaping the way people thought about religion, politics, and society. Even the religious leaders of Geneva were not immune to these changes. Theologians and pastors, who once strictly adhered to Calvinist doctrine, began to embrace more liberal and rational views. One such figure was Jacob Vernet, a professor of theology at the Genevan Academy. Vernet believed that reason and religion should go hand in hand. He argued that God's revelations through nature and human conscience were just as important as the teachings of the Bible. Vernet even suggested that people who had never heard of Christianity, like those in Africa, could still be saved if they lived good lives according to their natural understanding of right and wrong. This idea was a far cry from the strict Calvinist belief that only those predestined by God could be saved. Vernet's views were not unique. Other Genevan pastors, like Jacob Vernes and Paul Moutou, also showed signs of moving away from traditional Calvinism. They were more interested in promoting moral order and human well-being than in enforcing strict religious dogma. For example, Moutou, a pastor who admired Rousseau, believed that as long as the church respected essential moral values, it didn't need to worry too much about theological conformity. The influence of the Enlightenment on Geneva's religious leaders was evident in their sermons and teachings. They stopped emphasizing the fear of God and the threat of eternal damnation, which were central to Calvinist thought. Instead, they focused on God's love and benevolence. This shift in religious thinking contributed to a more secular mindset among the people of Geneva. The changes in religious attitudes can also be seen in the way people wrote their wills. In the early 1700s, many wills included requests for religious rituals, such as masses for the dead and donations to the church. By the late 1700s, these religious elements were much less common. People were less concerned with the afterlife and more focused on the well-being of their survivors. This trend was similar to what was happening in other parts of Europe, such as France, where historians have noted a decline in religious piety and an increase in secular thinking. The impact of these changes on everyday life was significant. For example, attitudes toward children changed. Traditional Calvinist teachings held that children were naturally sinful and needed strict discipline. However, by the mid-1700s, Genevan pastors began to preach that children were born with a natural inclination to do good. This new view emphasized the importance of nurturing children's positive qualities rather than punishing their perceived faults. The decline of religious superstition was another sign of the secularization of Geneva. In the early 1700s, there were still cases of people being investigated for selling books on magic. However, these cases often involved foreigners, not Genevans. The local authorities, while they punished the sellers, did not take the magical claims seriously. This skepticism toward the occult was a clear indication that the Genevan population was becoming more rational and less influenced by supernatural beliefs. In the end, the late 1700s in Geneva saw a significant shift from the strict Calvinism of the past to a more liberal and rational approach to religion. The influence of the Enlightenment, the changing attitudes of religious leaders, and the secularization of everyday life all contributed to this transformation. Geneva, once known as the city of Calvin, was now becoming the city of Rousseau and Voltaire, reflecting the broader changes taking place in European society during the Age of Reason. In the late 1700s, a prosecutor named Galiffe was really upset about people still believing in magic. He thought it was silly and dangerous. Galiffe was even more upset that some people were using these beliefs to trick others and steal from them. He pointed out that a guy named Maury had already been caught doing this before and admitted to doing it again. Galiffe said that even though people used to be punished severely for practicing magic, now they were only punished for the harm they caused to society and individuals. The small council, which was like a group of judges, decided to punish Maury. They made him apologize publicly, return the money he took, and spend 5 months in jail. This showed that even though some people still believed in magic, the authorities didn't take it seriously anymore. Interestingly, the victims in these cases were often foreigners, probably Catholics, who were less educated and more likely to believe in magic. The people of Geneva, who were mostly literate and Protestant, were less likely to fall for these tricks. This shows that by the late 1700s, belief in the supernatural was becoming less common, especially among the educated. In the early 1800s, a judge named Guillaume Prévost noticed something interesting about suicide rates in Geneva. He found that Catholics, who made up about 42% of the population, only committed about 20% of the suicides. On the other hand, Protestants, who made up about 58% of the population, committed about 80% of the suicides. This means that Catholics were less likely to commit suicide, even though they made up a smaller part of the population. Prévost's numbers showed that the suicide rate for Catholics was about 11.7 per 100,000 people, while for Protestants, it was about 34.8 per 100,000 people. This was a big difference. One reason for this might be that Catholics lived more in rural areas, where communities were tighter and more supportive. Another reason could be that Catholics still believed more in the supernatural, which might have given them more comfort and less reason to take their own lives. Historians like Tronchin think that as people became more rational and less religious in the 1700s, behaviors like suicide became more common. In Geneva, the increase in suicide started with wealthy merchants. One merchant named Jacques Grijumier, who killed himself in 1679, had a small library that included both religious and non-religious books. This showed that he was more interested in a variety of topics, not just religion. By the early 1700s, when another merchant named Antoine Mallet took his own life, the cultural atmosphere had changed even more. Mallet had a large library with many secular books, and he seemed to have a more diverse set of interests. Mallet's suicide is a good example of how people's interests were changing. He had a stable family life and a bright future, but he still chose to end his life. Before jumping into the river, he was seen praying, which might seem religious, but it was different from the strict religious practices of earlier times. Mallet's library showed that he was more interested in history, law, and literature than in religion. Another merchant, François Dupuget, who killed himself in 1722, also had a varied library with a mix of religious and secular books. This suggests that even if religion was still important, it was not the only thing that mattered to him. Even later in the century, a young lawyer named Jean-Louis Tronchin, who took his own life in 1773, showed increasingly secular interests. His father, Jean-Robert Tronchin, was a well-known jurist who believed in reducing harsh punishments and focusing on crime prevention. This shows that the legal system was becoming more modern and less influenced by religious beliefs. All these examples show that as people became more educated and interested in a variety of topics, religion played a smaller role in their lives. This change in mindset might have made it easier for some people to consider suicide, especially those who were more secular and less bound by religious prohibitions. Jean-Louis Tronchin, the only child of Jean-Robert Tronchin, was a man of the Enlightenment. When he passed away, an inventory of his belongings revealed that he was not just wealthy, but also very educated. He owned 3 violins and 2 upright basses, which showed his love for music. But what really stood out was his impressive library. At a time when books were expensive and hard to come by, Tronchin had a collection of 376 titles, many of which were large, multi-value works. His library included a wide variety of books. He had many works by classical authors like Julius Caesar, Cicero, Homer, and Virgil, both in Latin and French. Tronchin also had a keen interest in history and law, with books like the Corpus Juris Civilis and Justinian's Institutionum. He was well versed in the ideas of Enlightenment thinkers like Diderot, Montesquieu, Voltaire, and David Hume. Interestingly, he owned several works by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, even though his father had a long-standing feud with Rousseau and once advocated burning Rousseau's books. Despite his father's conservative views, Tronchin's library was largely secular. Out of 376 titles, only 7 were traditional religious works, such as Bibles and sermons. This reflected a trend in Geneva during the 18th century, where the libraries of people from different social classes were becoming more secular. At the beginning of the century, religious books made up more than a third of personal libraries, especially among artisans. By the 1780s, this number had dropped to just 8%. Books on arts, sciences, and literature became more popular, especially among artisans. One example of this trend is Jacques Argaud, a Genevan watchmaker who died in 1782. Argaud had a library with many volumes of classics, works on mathematics and music, and a complete set of the Encyclopedia. He was a big fan of Rousseau, owning 24 volumes of his works. This shift in reading habits was not limited to the wealthy. Even among the lower classes, people were reading more secular works. The decline of religious influence on everyday life was evident in other ways too. Theatrical productions, which were once banned in Geneva as a form of decadence, became popular by the 1780s. Dancing, which was also forbidden, was eventually allowed and regulated by the city. Card playing, once prohibited, became a taxable activity. These changes show that religion was no longer the central force in Genevan society. The consistory, which used to have a strong influence over people's lives, lost much of its power. People had more personal freedom, but this also led to feelings of isolation and alienation, which could contribute to suicidal behavior. However, this secularization was not universal. Some people, like the publisher Jean-Antoine Pelissari, who took his own life in 1738, still had strong religious beliefs. Pelissari was deeply troubled by his sins and sought forgiveness from God. His behavior was a stark contrast to the more secular trends of the time. Despite the growing secularization, women in Geneva still had limited access to education. This might explain why there was a gender gap in suicide rates, with men being more likely to take their own lives. Men were better educated and more exposed to the ideas of the Enlightenment, which could lead to a sense of moral individualism and a weakening of traditional beliefs. One example of a religiously motivated suicide is Jean-Jacques Melancholy, a young watchmaker who shot himself in 1769, Melancholy was a religious young man who also showed a strong interest in the Enlightenment. He left behind a collection of books including devotional works and writings by Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Albrecht von Haller. The changing attitudes in Geneva during the 18th century reflect a broader shift from a religious culture to a more secular society. While religion remained important for some, it was no longer the dominant force shaping people's lives and beliefs. In the late 1700s, a young watchmaker named Melancholy wrote a 15-page manuscript just before he took his own life. This manuscript, titled Reflections on Suicide, was more like a treatise than a suicide note. It was detailed and eloquent, with a strong religious theme running throughout. Melancholy began by acknowledging that the desire to live is a divine gift. He believed that God had given humans a love for life to keep them from knowing their destiny. This uncertainty, he argued, makes people cling to life even when it is painful. He pointed out that even old people facing death often wish to live longer. Melancholy asked, why, if the love of life is so strong, suicide is considered a crime? He argued that life is a gift from God, and just as God has given humans dominion over nature, He has also given them dominion over their own lives. Melancholy questioned the idea that suicide is a crime because we do not give ourselves life. He noted that this idea is not found in the Bible, neither in the Old nor the New Testament. He believed that God created humans with free will, and that life is one of the many gifts God has given us. Melancholy asked if God would punish someone for being too sensitive to life's hardships. He used the analogy of a person amputating a painful limb to suggest that if one's soul becomes unbearable, it might be justifiable to separate it from the body. Melancholy also discussed the idea of the soul surviving the body. He believed that if a person's soul is pure and noble, and if they have used their abilities for good, God would not punish them for taking their own life. However, he was clear that this did not apply to those who lived for selfish and hedonistic desires. Such people, he argued, would not find peace in death because they had not lived a life of virtue. Melancholy's views were influenced by both religion and Enlightenment thinking. He praised nature and saw God as the creator of a beautiful and ordered universe. He believed that a person who is guided by intellect rather than base desires can truly appreciate the wonders of nature. He described how such a person feels rejuvenated and ennobled by the beauty of the world around them, from the green meadows to the stars in the sky. In his final prayer, Melancholy invoked the name of Jesus Christ, asking for God's mercy and forgiveness. He acknowledged his faults and fears about the afterlife, but reminded God of his good intentions. He thanked God for giving him a soul capable of knowing and loving him. Melancholy's prayer was a mix of religious devotion and Enlightenment rationality, emphasizing God's goodness and compassion over his judgment. Another watchmaker, Pierre d'Ambray, also took his life in 1787. d'Ambray, who was 47, was a poet and a cultivated man. He wrote a prayer before his suicide, which echoed Enlightenment themes. d'Ambray asked God for mercy, saying that he was burdened by the miseries of life. He believed that his decision to end his life was not an offense to God, as it was an act of grace. d'Ambray's prayer was more secular in tone, with a vague reference to a heavenly being rather than a specific Christian God. Charles Dalloz, a 35-year-old aide-de-camp, also committed suicide in 1793. He was upset about the direction of the French Revolution during the Reign of Terror. Before he died, he wrote to a friend, wondering if there was anything after death. This uncertainty about the afterlife was common among people who took their own lives during this period. By the late 1700s, suicide notes had become more common in Geneva, as they did in France and other parts of Europe. These notes often justified the act, reinforcing the idea that suicide was a rational decision. They also reflected the increasing secularization of society, where religious fears of divine wrath and damnation had diminished. While some people, like Mellerit and Dombre, left notes that were influenced by Enlightenment, thinking most Genevans who committed suicide did so for more personal reasons, such as financial problems, unrequited love, the death of a loved one, or mental and physical illness. The decline in religious deterrents, such as the fear of God and the belief in divine judgment, made it easier for people to consider suicide. The change in religious beliefs and practices was a crucial factor in the increase in suicides during this period, as people became less afraid of divine punishment and more focused on their individual freedoms. The act of taking one's own life seemed less terrible. The cultural shift away from a strong religious framework contributed to a more secular mentality, which ultimately played a significant role in shaping modern attitudes towards suicide. In the world of the past, people's understanding of mental health and suicide was quite different from what we know today. Back then, many believed that mental illness and suicide were caused by supernatural forces, like the devil or divine punishment. One of the key figures in this era was Increase Mather, who warned in a sermon in Boston in 1682 that Satan often took advantage of people who were feeling down, tempting them to reject God. His son, Cotton Mather, shared this belief a decade later. In Germany, during the 16th and 17th centuries, doctors started to see mental illness as something that could be caused by the devil, but only after they had tried all other medical treatments. If no natural cause could be found, they concluded that the problem must be supernatural. This view was influenced by the religious and cultural changes of the time, especially the Reformation, which brought about new ideas about sin and salvation. In Geneva, a city known for its strict religious practices, the consistory, a religious court, played a significant role in people's lives. The consistory often questioned people about their religious beliefs and practices, and sometimes this pressure led to tragic outcomes. For example, some people who were questioned by the consistory became so distressed that they took their own lives. However, the consistory's main goal was to strengthen community ties, not to cause harm. As time went on, the way people thought about mental illness and suicide began to change. By the 18th century, there was a growing belief that these issues could be understood and treated through medicine and science rather than just through religion. This shift was part of a broader movement called the Enlightenment, which emphasized reason and scientific thinking. However, even with these changes, the idea that mental illness and suicide were linked to sin or demonic possession persisted in some places. For example, in rural areas of France, people often believed that illnesses were caused by demons or were a sign of divine punishment. In the city of Geneva, records show that many people who took their own lives were described as being mad or alienated. These terms were used to describe a wide range of mental health issues, from severe mental illness to more mild forms of distress. The city's officials had specific ways of dealing with these cases, often involving punishments like confiscating the person's property or dragging their body through the streets. Despite these harsh practices, some people in Geneva were treated more leniently. For example, in one case, a man named Cartier was allowed to be buried in the regular cemetery, although without any special honors. When we look at the people who committed suicide in Geneva, we see a mix of different backgrounds. Some were wealthy, some were poor, and many were in between. Interestingly, physical illness was a factor in a higher proportion of suicides after 1750 compared to earlier times. Today, we understand that mental health is a complex issue influenced by many factors, including biology, environment, and social conditions. The history of suicide and mental illness in places like Geneva and Germany reminds us that our understanding of these issues has evolved significantly over time. It also highlights the importance of treating mental health with compassion and scientific knowledge rather than fear and superstition.